Rise by Teese Snyder. Chapter 15. Go Time. Derek Riggs, Los Angeles, 2018. I felt great. Better than great, actually. I felt alive. I savored each breath and bounced off each step. All this despite the fact I was at work. I was even reciting my job description in a surprisingly upbeat inner monologue that day. Of course, it had occurred to me that the police might come to my workplace and escort me out of the building, but my act of heroism at the grocery store the night prior was clearly in self-defense. They could understandably make the argument that I was illegally carrying and concealing a deadly weapon, and I could understandably make the argument that if I hadn't been, I'd be dead. The way I saw it, the police wouldn't care about the man I'd dismembered any more than I did. And likely, the matter wouldn't go any further than stitching the dumb bastard's arm back on before he was sent to jail. However, despite my self-assurances of how righteous my vigilante justice was, a tickle of trepidation lingered in the back of my mind. If they were to bring charges against me and decided to extend their inquisition to the contents of my home, I would be in much deeper trouble than the man who had held me at gunpoint. Besides the large quantities of explosives I used to manufacture noisemakers, flares, grenades, and other varieties of destructive and primarily distractive devices, I housed an abundance of illegal off-the-grid firearms. My emergency rations, custom-made bicycle, lightweight body armor, and a stockpile of purified drinking water would raise eyebrows, no doubt, but incarceration would only result from the more, quote, deadly items in my possession. And the longer I sat at work poring over the memory of my subtle and deadly blade work, the more uncertain I became. The single worst place to be in the event of an infection was locked in a cell, forgotten and abandoned by the living, solely concerned with their own well-being. I could not afford to go to prison under any circumstances. I eyed the entrance anxiously, noticing for the first time in the course of my aloof daydreaming that the office was surprisingly quiet today. I had always arrived early for work, deliberately devising my travel schedule to avoid crowds and congestion. And while nearly always the first or second in the building, I had grown accustomed to the steady trickle of my office mates after the fact. I stood up from my desk and glanced around, taking note of the vast majority of vacant seats and missing people. I furrowed my brow and turned in the direction of Tracy, the woman who shared the cubicle space with me, and unbeknownst to her, more of my thoughts than I would ever admit. I contemplated voicing my concerns to her, but unaccustomed to sentimental feelings towards other people, decided it best to refrain. I continued my recon of office attendants, stepping outside of my cubicle to do an exact count. Greg, the office alpha douchebag and the first person I killed in my post-apocalypse daydreams, was also, unfortunately, accounted for. A couple of elderly individuals that I had nicknamed Ghoulbait were sleeping at their desks, and the mailroom kid was making his rounds from office to office. However, what was most striking in my mind was the absence of upper management, the absence of the secretarial staff and cleaning people. Perhaps there was some large traffic jam or extenuating circumstance that had slipped my attention. Then, as my gut began to churn and my brain returned from reminiscing about the night prior, I began to speculate that the unexplained disappearances of my colleagues was something more than a coincidence. I quickly made my way to the desk of a secretary I knew to be responsible for keeping tabs on tardiness and attendance. I picked up her phone and checked her messages, 56 of which were from this morning alone. "Hey, Faye, this is Morgan Taft calling. I'm not going to be able to make it into work today. My stomach is killing me," a sickly sounding individual stated, pausing in between words to swallow and wince. Next message. "I haven't called in sick before, so I'm not really sure who I'm supposed to talk to. But this is Beatrice from marketing, and I'm afraid I'm just not feeling well enough to make it in today. I'll call in the afternoon in the event I've started to feel better. Thanks." Next message. "Faye, it's JJ. I don't know if I ate something I shouldn't have or what, but my stomach feels like it's digesting itself. Oh man, no way I'm making it into work. I'll feel better in time for softball practice this weekend, though. Guaranteed." I stopped listening to the messages, disturbed by the information I had acquired. 3 people from the same office were sick immediately after a weekend, and based on the trend of messages, many more were too. Something clearly wasn't right, but before I went wading through the rest of the voicemail for clues, I remembered the recently installed viewing screen in the center of the office. I placed the receiver down and made my way to the large flat-screen television traditionally used for broadcasting financial news or office memos in plain view of everyone. However, as I powered on the TV, the picture slowly illuminated to reveal a breaking news headline instead of a rolling stock portfolio. The title of "Global Riots Turn Violent" caught my eye, but it was the sight of carnage on the screen that grabbed my attention. A sight I had anticipated for so long that all I could muster upon finally witnessing it was a quivering yelp of giddy disbelief. I cranked the volume as loud as it would go, then breathed deeply, remaining in the moment just long enough for the other people in the office to notice and come to stand by my side, awestruck by the images flashing on the screen. "Reports from every major city in almost 100 countries are flooding in every minute," the reporter announced, appearing nauseated and faint. Her expression was pale, and she appeared to struggle with not only reading the teleprompter, but the magnitude of the events unfolding before her as well. "It's not clear what incited the riots, but martial law has been, she attempted to say, looking away from the camera in the direction of someone behind the lens. Her eyes were full of fear as she slipped from her seat and fell to the floor, too sick to continue. The picture quickly changed from where she had been sitting to stock footage from webcams and traffic cameras of hundreds, if not thousands, of people running down blood-covered streets, while other people hobbled with outstretched arms in their direction, tearing the clothes from those they had managed to trap, sinking their teeth in as if they'd just unwrapped a candy bar. My office mates gasped in horror, raising their hands to their mouths as their eyes began to water. "Oh my God," Tracy said as I caught her taking hold of Greg's hand out of the corner of my eye. "What in the world is happening?" I turned from the screen to make fleeting eye contact with her, broke away from my trance of disbelief, and pulled back to face the profound naivete of those around me. The elderly couple, the mailroom kid, Greg, and my secret crush, Tracy. None of them had a clue what was going on or what to do about it, and trying to explain it to them would only waste time and put my life at risk. They weren't a part of the plan, and as my eyes glanced from each of their terrified eyes, my senses came flooding back to me. What the fuck was I standing there for? What the fuck was I just standing there for? The television showed an ambulance flipped on its side, and the people whose legs were trapped under it were being eaten alive. My eyes blew out of their sockets with awe and adrenaline. This is it.
Empty-eyed cannibals clawing at anything that moved, sucking back chunks of bloody flesh like they're eating sushi. Mass panic, widespread infection, countless undead, and nobody in the entire fucking world but me has a goddamn clue what to do about it. This is it. This is it. It's go time. I pivoted to the nearest window and pulled aside the blinds to get a view of the street, nearly clear of pedestrian traffic. If I was going to try and make my escape from the building, it was clearly the only time I'd stand a chance. I ran back in the direction of my cubicle and ripped out a drawer from my desk, removing the machete that I had taped against the back of it in case of an emergency. Then, as my eyes turned upwards towards the exit, I noticed Greg, standing by Tracy with his arm around her. I froze for a fraction of a second, clenching my jaw in anger and disgust. This would be the last time I'd see her, and there was no fucking way I'd let that memory be tainted by him. I slid my machete under my belt and yanked my keyboard free of my computer. I snatched a piece of paper off my desk with my free hand and began crumpling it as I walked in Greg's direction. I picked up speed as I approached him. Then, just steps away, I threw the ball of paper I'd been crumpling into Greg's head and whistled loudly. He turned towards me just in time for me to smash the back of my keyboard into his face. He went down like a 200-pound pussy, and I lifted my eyes to meet Tracy's. She gasped, shocked and bewildered as I stepped closer to her. I leaned forward, wrapped my arm around her, and gently squeezed her ass as I kissed her goodbye. She kissed me back. That was the memory I needed. Now, I was ready to fuck shit up. I let Tracy go and made my way for the exit. The emergency stairwell was empty. People didn't know to run. They didn't understand the threat. The natural reaction of the average individual to an undead contagion is to presume that ghouls are just sick people who have lost their minds, to overlook the fact that they've stopped breathing and are no longer able to think or reason. The typical response of a populace is to retreat into fear and panic, to cluster together and to try and save the people they love, to cling to the comfort they've taken for granted for so long and ignore the severity of the situation before them. Over time, people have lost their God-given brutal nature by playing make-believe in their societal roles as docile sheep. And in the paradigm shift of disaster, they are caught bewildered and aghast, unable to make the transition back to a vicious nature, fight for their lives, or kill for their survival. Instead, they foolishly cling to the hope that someone will save them. Whether it's the police, the military, God, or its God, their ignorance is as much of a threat as the undead themselves. And long ago, I swore to disregard the repugnant stupidity of my fellow man when the infection came. I swore to fend for myself and myself alone. Only the strong survive. Abandon the weak. Forget morality and structure. The undead bring a new world order. I raced down the stairwell, 3 steps at a time, machete in hand, ready, waiting, and willing to kill. My best time for getting from the office to my apartment was 56 seconds. It was time for a new record. I pushed open the emergency exit door and burst out into the parking lot. It was bright outside, clear skies and few pedestrians. No screams or gunshots, only puzzled looks at the machete I held at my waist as I double-checked my surroundings for any sign of the infected. All clear. My bike was chained to a street lamp. The key was already in my hand. I breathed normally and kept cool. My movements were quick and precise, just like I practiced. I left my bike lock behind as I sped away from work. The back alleyway that led to my apartment was surprisingly clear. However, in between the heavy breaths I took, moving at full velocity, I could hear screams and commotion coming from the other side of the buildings I rode behind. As I approached a curb that looked out onto the main street in between alleyways, I glanced to the side, catching eye of crashed cars and a mob of approximately 20 people moving in all directions. But I moved past the street too quickly to assess the condition or threat level. I pedaled the full 4 blocks to my home in 38 seconds and screeched into the front of my apartment building, the key in my hand. I tossed my recreational bicycle aside, clearing the way for my exit from the complex. It was another 12 seconds until I reached my apartment, sprinting up the stairs until I entered the upper hallway that, fortunately, was free of ghouls. My machete was now tucked back into my belt, soon to be exchanged for my body armor and survival gear. But as I slid the key into my apartment lock, I noticed that many of my neighbors' closed doors were pounding from the inside, trying to get out. Slow, repetitive, forceful thuds. The unmistakable vigor of the undead. I pushed my door open, trying not to linger on how so many people could have been infected when inside of their apartments. Now banging on the doors, trying to break free. In all directions, I could hear their muffled, decrepit moans, filling my head with more and more urgency. I needed to move faster. Every second wasted put me that much closer to death. Move, move, move. I ripped off my clothes and tossed them aside, pulling open my closet and removing my armor. A custom-built contraption somewhere in between mountain biking apparel and riot gear. Designed to be resistant to knives, bites, and blunt force trauma, it provided me a slim protection from the oncoming onslaught. With built-in blades, catheter, compass, water purification system, and other small, compact necessities that must remain on my person at all times, it was one of my finest achievements. Despite its weight of nearly 25 pounds, I had trained in it so often that I had grown accustomed to its size and feel, to the way the materials breathed and moved. In my armor, I was no longer a man. I was a motherfucking death machine. Next, I equipped my reinforced waterproof backpack that could just as easily be locked into my armor as it could be detached from it, filled with my food and water reserves, as well as a small container of ammunition, a first aid kit, map, rope, sleeping bag, blankets, soap, matches, and the other basic necessities for surviving on the go. It was of vital importance to my ongoing survival. I holstered my sidearm before securing both my rifle and my katana to my back via a heat-activated catch-and-release magnet system that responded only to the warm touch of those still living. I then fastened my utility belt containing my more delicate armaments, flares, noisemakers, cyanide release capsules, flashbangs, and my specialty child safety grenades that required multiple ignition steps to deploy effectively. After that, I slid on my full-face helmet with its shatterproof polarized lens. I then adjusted the eyepiece that hovered over my left eye, feeding off external solar panels to recharge the lithium battery inside the helmet that powered its infrared and night vision applications. I powered on my HUD and fluttered my eyes to try and adjust to the transparent view that the pinhole camera on the back of the helmet gave me of my surroundings. Then, last and most importantly, I prepared my bicycle. Due to its many modifications and its subsequent value, it had not been rational for me to use it recreationally. The core model of the bike matched that of my other now discarded bicycle. However, it was the addition of numerous welds and gadgets that differentiated it. A built-in momentum converter could be turned on to capture the excess energy from each pedal and movement, using it to recharge batteries for my helmet and other associated electronics. Gaps in the frame allowed me to comfortably grip it both for periods of travel where riding was no longer viable and also to detach the wheels and use as a weapon if absolutely necessary. The shocks and spokes were both encased by a thin layer of metal to keep the debris or extremities from becoming lodged in them, and a system of LED lights were installed throughout the frame, easily triggered by remote if the need for a distraction or a signal to other survivors arose. I picked up my bike and pushed it forward on its rear wheel, knocking open my front door as I re-entered the hall. Only now, many of the ghouls had managed to break through the doors they had been banging on. Shards of broken wood littered the floor as pale arms protruded from all directions. I paused, calculated my trajectory, and mounted my bicycle. Then, after nodding a final farewell to the apartment I'd called home for the last decade of my life. I pedaled ferociously down the hall, ducking under the reach of arms and maneuvering around the emerging ghouls. I reached the stairs and flipped my bike onto its back wheel again, jumping down from each flight of stairs, using my bike like a pogo stick to break my fall. But as I descended each level, more and more undead appeared, breaking their way out of their rooms and wandering down the halls in the direction of the noise I was making. I breathed heavily as I made the final leap to the ground level, kicking an undead in the chest as I did so. It flew back and knocked over a few stragglers lumbering behind it, giving me the window I needed to make my escape. I leaned my shoulder into the door and burst out of the apartment complex into the alley. I swung my bike under me and started pedaling in the direction of the park, periodically steering my way around lumbering ghouls and panicked civilians. Somehow, the infection had already spread wider and faster than I'd ever imagined, even in the worst-case outbreak scenarios. The very fact that the undead were still locked safely in their apartments and had to break out rather than in defied conventional logic. That there was an incubation period for people to die and rise was clear, but in order for so many people to be simultaneously infected, isolated, and transitioned into the walking dead meant that the circumstances of contagion had somehow been drastically expedited. Day 1 of the outbreak had already reached the severity of day 10. It didn't make any sense. My escape plan wasn't designed for this. I had never considered ubiquitous infection. It seemed too unlikely, too absurd. And as I watched more and more ghouls flood out of buildings and into the streets, swarming around the few helpless civilians that remained, I realized that at this rate, I not only could be surrounded and overrun, I would be. How in the fuck was this happening? I felt more angry and frustrated with myself than I had ever been, because after a lifetime of preparing and pushing myself, when the day finally came and the end of civilization dawned, I was nearly as unprepared and vulnerable as everyone else. Move, move, move! I peeled out of the back alley into a roundabout congested with crashed cars and frantic people. Everyone was either screaming or moaning, and the sound of my heavy breathing was swallowed by the chaos. On the other side of the street was a park that had a scenic trail that led all the way from the outer city to the border of a natural park. In every training drill and practice run that I'd done, the problem areas that I identified were the highways that, in my mind, should have been congested with civilians trying to flee the infected zones. However, as I looked at the carnage and disarray of the street before me, I realized that people never even had the chance to run for their lives. The entire fucking city seemed to have been eaten alive in an instant, and though I tried to keep myself from becoming awed or frozen by what was happening, my mind just couldn't comprehend the speed of infection. My momentum slowed as I approached the traffic block, trying to devise a way through or around. A woman hysterically cried behind the driver's seat of her car as a patch of undead banged continuously against her windows, leaving smears of blood and parts of their leaking entrails across the glass. A police officer with a gash in his neck, spurting blood out of an artery like a sprinkler, fell to the ground, releasing a few final shots into the torso of an unfazed infected. Women, girls, men, and boys all screamed and ran, flailing their limbs and arbitrarily striking the undead. And with each failed blow, I could see the panic in their eyes boil over. I could see the confusion and shock consume them as they were overrun and devoured, one by one. A motionless corpse suddenly twitched to its feet, no longer human, no longer alive, just another slave in the soon-to-be billions of ghouls dredging across the world, consuming every last soul. And as I came to nearly a complete stop on the brink of congestion, I dismounted my bicycle, watching as a dozen or more undead lumbered towards me, their arms stretched and their mouths open. For a fleeting moment, my mind returned to the apartment I had just escaped. I questioned my plan and second-guessed my motivation. Back there, I had food and water enough to last me months, and I abandoned it all. I had weapons and munitions, I had a shortwave radio and an emergency generator. I had everything, absolutely everything. But it was my excitement in the moment of outbreak that clouded my judgment. The situation called for a fortified response, not the cut-and-run contingency. I should have seen how bad the infection was rather than simply reacting to the fact that it had finally happened. I should have known better. Why was I so stupid? After a lifetime of training, pain, and sacrifice, when my time finally came, there I stood, like a piece of fucking bait. One man against hundreds of ghouls, preying and leeching from the living until their hollow, empty eyes fell only on me. Until each and every motherfucking one of those godforsaken undead pieces of shit lumbered in my direction. And not only that, there and then, I had the goddamn audacity to feel sorry for myself, to dare to lower myself to everyone else's pathetic, sniveling cowardice, to be afraid. No fucking way. If the undead wanted me, they could come and get me. Bring it on, motherfuckers. I pulled my bike up onto my shoulder, where a ridged magnet would keep it steady, allowing me free use of my left arm and restricted use of my right. I then ripped my katana off my back with my right hand and yanked my sidearm out of its holster with my left. The ghouls now lumbered within a few feet of me, closing in on all directions in the dense circle of undead. Under any other circumstances, firing a gunshot would only result in drawing more attention to myself and my location. However, given the fact that every ghoul on the street was coming in my direction for me alone, I really didn't give a fuck. I let out 6 shots from my pistol, sweeping from one forehead to the next as the hollow point bullets I used blew them into mush. Then, catching outreached arms almost upon me and the camera on the back of my helmet, I swung around, switching the weapons in my hands, and brought the blade across one jugular after another, slicing through throats and severing heads like a gas-powered guillotine. I backed up in the direction of the fallen, now headless ghouls, stepping over their corpses as I approached the circle of crashed cars. I continued to fire at select ghouls, calculating how each would fall and how the others would fill their places. Then, as a window of space revealed itself, I charged forward, jumping on top of a vehicle and leapfrogging from one car's roof to another. The bulk of the ghouls clumsily bumped up against the wreckage, able to climb but not quickly, trying to follow in pursuit. However, it was the undead, lodged in between cars, trying to snatch my legs, that now posed the greatest threat. I temporarily holstered my sidearm, lifting my right hand to support my shouldered bicycle, while using the other to sever the limbs of the undead before they could reach me. On the border of the traffic circle was a patch of road that bridged the short gap between the carnage and the park. Problem was, it was almost entirely filled with ghouls. I lowered my hand from my bike, adjusting my movements to keep it from wobbling too much and throwing off my balance, and pulled 2 grenades off of my utility belt. I then applied the 3-point pressure necessary to detonate them with a 3-second delay. An outstretched, decrepit arm of a morbidly obese ghoul grazed against my leg. barely missing a grip that could have pulled me down and ended the fight. Fortunately, as the grenades left my hand and entered the crowd of ghouls ahead, another car crashed into the circle, forcing the obese ghoul's arm just inches further away. After a few more quick cuts of my blade, I swung it behind me and slapped it onto its magnetic sheath. Then, with all the momentum I could build, and the half of a second left on the timer before the grenades I'd thrown detonated, I pulled my bike off of my shoulder, held it out in front of me, and jumped from the top of the car over the crowd of ghouls. Boom! Dust chips of pavement, dirt, and a whole shitload of blood and guts burst into the air, pelting me from beneath an instant before my bike was back under me. Car windows blew out as their alarms and airbags exploded, ringing out in the aftermath of the blast. I hung in midair for what seemed like seconds, hoping that whatever body part I landed on was demolished enough to give my tires traction. The area that had been densely packed with the undead now resembled a mortar blast with only remnants of people's bodies twitching on the ground. And as I came crashing down into the blast site, holding my breath for the impact, a grin of elation and adrenaline spread across my face. I landed firmly, able not only to keep my balance but also pedal ferociously through the gap in the crowd before they had time to swarm around me. I exited the traffic circle of doom and approached the park, picking up speed and laughing in between breaths. I just killed at least 50 undead. Bitches. I quickly pedaled into the relatively open area of the park and put some distance between myself and the traffic circle. My ears were still ringing from the grenades I'd thrown. I could still taste the pulverized pieces of the road that had been blasted into the air. My adrenaline was running high. I maneuvered around clusters of undead wandering in the park, about as threatening in open areas as vibrating pylons with teeth. But it was when they formed groups that I needed to be careful. And sure enough, every direction that I turned, I saw wave after wave of undead searching for someone to attack. There was no saving the infected, only killing them. But because of the remarkable speed that the infection had spread, I couldn't even slow down to lob off heads or crack a few skulls. I had to keep moving, try to stay ahead of the swarms of ghouls that consumed the area. I cycled quickly without delay, moving over the grass and across paths, and as I approached each cluster of the undead, I spotted gaps between them and timed my movements with theirs, shooting in between outstretched arms and clamoring hands as I headed at full speed towards the next stretch of my escape. The park I pedaled through consisted of nice patches of green grass running adjacent to a major highway that at times ran overhead. I had selected it for my escape because it was a spacious, scenic route that led to seldom-used shipping and receiving lots. Those lots, in turn, connected to open-area roads that could easily be pedaled on the side of in the event of traffic congestion. These roads then spread out to more secluded routes and then on to safer ground, a natural park filled with overgrown paths and rocky terrain that, by way of connecting to other parks, led almost all the way to Canada. I had made the trip annually during my vacation time every year for the past decade in order to practice. I had never failed to achieve the full distance in less than 3 weeks' time. But this was no practice run. The maneuvers I had to make to avoid the undead were slowing me more than I'd expected. I constantly had to adjust my pedaling speed and burst through packs of ghouls without getting surrounded or knocked down, like a game of tag with an entire population. I reminded myself that all I had to do was make it out of the city, but I had never, ever imagined that the infection would be so bad. The waves of ghouls grew denser and harder to maneuver through or around. Suddenly, I didn't even know if I could reach the end of the park, and if for any reason I had to stop and completely change directions, It would likely mean I'd never get the chance to start moving again. Undead flooded into the park from all around. I was running out of room, fast, and no matter how hard I tried to cycle or move, I could feel myself slowing down. But then, I heard something bizarre. My handlebars began to shake as a thunderous noise came from the direction of the highway that crossed overhead of the park. I glanced up to see tips of wings bearing down as the noise turned to a shrill and deafening roar that I now recognized as a descending aircraft. A 747, nose tilted down, going full speed and headed for the area right in front of me. I sat upright on my bicycle and let my neck drift towards the sky just as the plane collided with the overpass. My mouth drooped open in awe, watching chunks of concrete and cars explode in every direction. What remained of the plane shot forward, a roaring ball of flames that tumbled off the highway and spilled out into the park ahead of me. I pulled my head down, hoping that no debris would crush me in the few seconds' distance between myself and the crashing plane. The smoldering mess of the remaining aircraft carved through the ground, spinning wildly and breaking into pieces. Charred remains of passengers and seats flipped out of the vessel, and I brought my eyes to the ground, trying to determine if there were any route through the scars of dirt and burning wreckage. I couldn't stop. If I did, I'd be overrun and devoured. But I also couldn't see past the smoke of the crash I raced towards. The fields behind me were packed with ghouls. There was no turning back. I had no choice. I pedaled harder to build up speed and crouched low on my bicycle, preparing to jump through the smoke. I flew through the air, leaping over the gap that the crashed plane had gouged into the ground, and landed in a narrow stretch of dirt between a flaming car and a smoldering corpse. I tucked myself neatly through plumes of smoke, hoping with each one that I'd clear it without hitting any debris or undead. Then as I popped out the other side of the wreckage, my eyes turned to the sky once more as something caught my attention. Numerous other planes either circled overhead or dove sharply towards the ground. Like a flock of birds hit by a flashbang, they wavered and fell, no doubt full of infected. And as my eyes lingered on the sight, the full realization of what was really happening dawned on me. The answer to the questions buzzing in my mind finally came. Because if so many planes had managed to make it into the air with infected on board, all the way past security, and funneled into a vessel that had no business taking flight with wounded passengers on board, it meant not only were its passengers unaware of the infection when they had boarded, it meant that they had to have become infected in a way that they were kept unaware of. That meant the outbreak was planned. And if it was planned, it meant the infection was manufactured. Unfortunately for me, that was not one of the scenarios I'd theorized or planned to survive. I could see the end of the park about 100 feet ahead of me, a narrow strip of grass and converging paths. It was in my mind the final obstacle before a clear stretch out of the city. But as I watched the gaps in between ghouls, I could see that the plane crash had pulled every undead in earshot towards my location. Thousands of ghouls now lumbered in my direction, funneling into the very part of the park that I intended to cycle through. The crowd pulsed and swarmed, moving tighter and tighter together, swallowing the open ground like lava. I pedaled harder, ducking down low to limit my exposure. Then, with only a narrow fraction of space left between ghouls, I rode my bicycle full speed into the undead horde. Hands and arms slapped at my armor, trying to get a grip of me as my momentum slowed from their impact.
I pushed down heavily on my pedals, refusing to come to a stop. The sounds of the moaning undead that surrounded me rang out as loud as the plane overhead had, like the deafening cry of hell, pulling me in and sucking me under. I could smell their rotten breath and taste the festering damp air they regurgitated. My legs came down again and again, feeling fingernails graze my armor. The gap I navigated through narrowed even more, but I continued to move forward, only a few feet from an opening. Fingers clutched onto me, finding grips, slowing me down. But I refused to die there. I kept going, kept moving. And then, just at the moment I was almost pulled to a complete stop, I felt the grip of a ghoul slip, and I burst forward, pedaling out of the mob and into nearly clear pavement. I made it through. Just barely. I made it through.